Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Last week we had as our guests the same people we have this week, and we're doing a 2-week program on women's issues as it relates to some particular areas. And we're so pleased to have these two guests back from the Women's Center, which is located in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and these centers exist across America and even to our friends in Canada where this program also goes. We talked a lot last week about within our culture why such things as domestic violence takes place and also sexual assault. And we want to welcome back the program to continue that conversation. First of all, Sue, who is a violence prevention expert at the Women's Center, and next to her is Dorothy, who is a sexual assault victim advocate. And thank both of you for coming back. It was so informative, and you are so willing to share with us information that can be helpful to our viewers. And again, we look forward to the interview. And as always, I'm pleased to have our two regular panelists, Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And under our tradition, Janelle will start today's questioning.
Welcome back, Dot and Sue. My first question is going to be for Sue. We've been talking about domestic violence, and this week we're going to be talking about combating that domestic violence. And in order to do that, I guess we have to be able to identify what it is. So let's talk a little bit about the cycle of violence that occurs in a relationship. Can you define that for us and help our viewers understand it?
Sure. The cycle of violence in domestic violence relationships has been identified maybe 20 years ago. And we've changed the way we think about it a little bit over the years. And basically it kind of goes like this. I'm very much simplifying it. You have a relationship, you're in a relationship, and everything's going along fine, but then you start to feel a little tension building. And we call that the tension building phase in the cycle, where perhaps you're snapping. In this case, I'm going to refer to one half as the abuser, comes home and is upset and is tense, snapping. Dinner's not ready quick enough. Everything's not perfect. You're being lazy. The house is a mess, and it starts to build. And the victim will oftentimes during that phase become quiet, try to do everything perfectly, and smooth everything over. That's the tension building phase. What it's leading to is some kind of an explosion. Early on in a relationship, that explosion is oftentimes just a verbal argument. But I hate to say that's all it is, because we all have those. I mean, in my own relationship, we go through periods of time where tension builds, and then we have a little bit of an explosion and have an argument.
I'm glad you explained that, so everybody thinks that they're engaged in domestic violence.
So that happens in normal relationships too. So most of us can relate to that. In an abusive relationship, it crosses the line. Rather than just being an argument, it becomes about power and control. And whatever the violence is, whether it's verbal violence or it's physical violence or throwing something or slamming something or punching a wall or the dirty looks, any of those things, the issue is to get control, exert that power so I get control over the victim and I get her to do what I want her to do or not do, or whatever the issue is. So that's the explosion. In domestic violence relationships, they then go through the next phase, which is called the honeymoon. The honeymoon phase is very depressing for those of us who work in the domestic violence field, because what happens in the honeymoon phase is, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again.
Genuinely.
I promise I'll get help. Let's go to a counselor. I love the kids. I can't stand the thought of anything breaking us up. Here's a dozen roses. Let's go out for dinner. And the abuser becomes the person that the victim fell in love with again. And the victim goes, there you are. I knew I wasn't wrong. So we start the cycle over again. And then eventually it goes into tension building. What happens in an abusive relationship is this cycle becomes more and more violent. and the explosion becomes an explosion. And the honeymoon phase just about disappears.
It becomes less and less,
Shorter and shorter.
shorter and shorter.
And threats, many threats during the explosion phase, I suppose.
Sometimes right before them
Yeah.
and during
oftentimes.
it. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add there, Dot, about the cycle of violence?
That's it in a nutshell. That model came up in Duluth. Ellen Pence, I believe, came up with that model.
I
what you
don't
just
think Ellen
described.
came up with
Oh.
that model. Ellen came up with a power and control
Oh,
wheel.
okay.
Yeah.
The wheel, that's what I
Yeah.
meant.
Yeah.
Okay. Which on the wheel describes what Sue went through, the tension building, the explosive, and the honeymoon. Just that it's oftentimes the threats, I think, are more beforehand and sometimes after. There's threats to take the children away, too, if the woman does say, I'm leaving you. I can't take this anymore.
One of the most dangerous times for a victim of domestic violence is when they're either trying to leave or have just left,
Yes, absolutely.
which is really frightening because being old school law enforcement, from being in law enforcement for a long time, back in the days when domestic violence wasn't a crime, we don't like to admit that, but I know that at the beginning of my career in law enforcement, when a woman would say to me, I'm afraid to leave, I'm afraid of him, I'm afraid of what he'll do, I made the mistake, as did many of us, oh, he won't do anything, he's just telling you that. Well, statistics have proven us wrong. That is the most dangerous time.
Absolutely.
So when, last week when we were talking about what family and friends can do, if a victim is getting ready to leave, and you really think they're going to, or if they've just left, the number one thing is to make sure they're safe.
Yes.
Because that is the most dangerous time. Sorry, I kind of interjected that, but
No, that's
That's
really
very
true.
important.
was
That's
real
really
important.
true.
Arna Reinhardt.
I want to go back to a little bit about what we talked about last week, because I loved your explanation of that cycle, because that explains it very well, and that was an eye opener for me when you explained the honeymoon period and why women then probably stay, because exactly what you said. Oh, he's back. Everything's fine. Everything's peachy. Explain again why it is so difficult for women to leave, and how come sometimes it takes them a while to go through that process. Because I thought that was so good.
A lot of it, sometimes the easiest way to understand it for those of you who are married or in a relationship is to think about your own relationship and how hard it would be to get out of that relationship. Now, I've been married 20 years. It would be very, very difficult. Even if it was awful. I have invested a lot, as we talked about. We've invested a lot into that relationship. Then you add into the mix kids. I have an 11-year-old son who absolutely worships his father. And I sure wouldn't want to take him away from his dad. No matter how bad his dad was. I still feel that way about my son. Then you add in the dynamics of this relationship, where oftentimes the female doesn't have a job, is completely isolated from her family and friends, because the abuser wants it that way, because he wants to have all the control over her. He controls all the finances, so she doesn't have any money.
Right. Maybe she doesn't even have job skills and so forth. She's been isolated so long.
And that's a lot of why. I mean, that kind of helps to explain why they don't leave.
I've actually heard women saying, you probably have too, Sue, where it's just easier to go back when they face some obstacles, such as trying to get work, trying to raise their 4 or 5 children, or 3 or 2. We know how expensive it is to just raise one child now.
I remember the very first time I went on a tour of a shelter, of a women's shelter. And after I did that, one of the things that I truly, absolutely believed was that every law enforcement officer needs to have a tour of a women's shelter, because not that they're bad, they're wonderful, they're beautiful, but boy, it would be hard to take your 4 kids there. And you don't really get that understanding unless you're there.
And oftentimes what we do too is try to encourage these victims, if they don't, when they go to shelters, oftentimes most shelters will have a case manager there to work with them, to get them to the areas they need to go to learn some job skills, or to get enrolled in a college, or But there's a lot of obstacles for women out there. It's not easy. That's
to
a
move
big
to another
barrier.
issue, that's just very, very powerful what you're talking about. I want to explain two things to our viewers. One is that we're not using your last name, and they're saying Tony must not know their last name or can't pronounce them or whatever. But we're doing it for security purposes and some of the work you do and how sensitive it is, and that's why we're not. Secondly, I'd ask our staff to put up the numbers again. They did in the last show, and I didn't mention what they were. These are national hotlines that can be contacted. So our viewers who are not in this area, they just went up there now, 2-800 numbers, and then they can give them information, but secondly, they can be referred back to their locality through that process. So I want to get that over to our viewers. I'd like to talk a little bit about, and I hope I'm correct in understanding this, but I have a wonderful friend here, and he has done courses on death and dying, and it's so powerful because he talks about in a family when there's a terminal illness that there's like 7 stages that the dying person goes through, and the family goes through stages. So let's talk in relation to the issue of if a woman is in a domestic violent situation or there's a sexual assault, either one of these situations that you both have come here to talk about, does she go through, and we've kind of worked around that a little bit, but does she go through different cycles that will, or different stages that gets her to the point of where she can be relieved from this serious problem?
She does. She oftentimes goes through a lot of the self-blame we talked about. Oftentimes the same reactions, the emotional and disbelief, embarrassment, shame, guilt. I'm talking about sexual assault as well as domestic violence.
So denial and guilt and shame and all those are different. Can they be at the same time, or they go through at certain points? One is more emphasized than another one.
I think that really depends on the victim and the circumstances of that particular relationship. They all go through them a little bit differently.
And not all at the same speed or whatever.
Right.
I think the very beginning one is powerlessness.
Okay.
And maybe, or maybe rape, or excuse me, denial. Some people might say in denial when it's a rape. Wasn't it just a rape? That's kind of a way of minimizing it. Some women say, like for instance, well, it was just a slap. Mm-hmm. That's a way of minimizing it. It's a little bit of denial there. It may very well be a survival skill.
Yeah, just like self-blame is. But they all go through them a little bit differently, and it just depends on the nature of that particular situation and the type of abuse.
Anxiety, anger.
The other thing I don't want the show to end without dealing with, and I've dealt with this with other guests before, and I'm just still totally puzzled about it, and we probably won't get the answer because maybe there isn't, but and maybe we will. But let's take a young boy. He's, say, from age 4 to 8 or 9, or as he's growing up, he is in a family where there's domestic violence. He watches his mother being beaten, and he's physically beaten. My first reaction is that when a young girl, this could happen too, but particularly since violence is more coming from men, this young boy goes through this and suffers. And would he not say to himself, if I can just live through this, someday when I'm an adult, I would never do this, and I want a family where there's peace, and I won't do to my children what I have suffered. Why isn't that the end result? Why isn't that the impact, Sue?
When you don't know anything else, you think that's the norm. You believe that that is how people show love because you don't know anything else. If I am raised in a home where my parents fight and then make up, they have an explosion and then they have a really nice honeymoon, I think that part of showing love, in order to get to there, you have to fight. It's very, very much learned behavior on the part of both boys and girls. And some of the statistics this is an area that we're really starting to look at now because a bunch of research has been done into it. And the statistics say that if you're a child raised in a home filled with domestic violence, you don't necessarily have to be abused yourself. Simply witnessing domestic violence in the home, as a child, you have, it's something like, I don't have the stats right in front of me. Actually, I do, but I can't read them because I don't have my glasses on. you have like a 70% greater chance of becoming a delinquent, committing a crime as a juvenile. Then as you get into adulthood, if you're a boy, you have a 50% greater chance of becoming a criminal, committing a crime and being arrested. If you're a girl, you have a 50% greater chance of becoming what they say involved in crime as a victim or a witness. So basically what I'm saying, and what that study told me to simplify it, is if you're a child raised in domestic violence and you're a boy, the chances are really high you're going to be an abuser when you grow up.
Either you will be an abuser or you will be the
If you're
victim.
a girl, you're going to be a victim.
That's what you know. One other quick point, I'll go back to the panel. I was talking to a student a couple of years ago here, and he was in the Human Equality Club, and he was involved in a lot of charities, and one of the more kind persons I've met. So I said to him one day, "You're really a remarkable person. You're so kind, and you're so charitable, and you're so sensitive about other people." And he said, "Yes, thank you." He said, "I can explain it. I come from a family filled with love." And so if you have that environment, then that's the behavior you understand, and you can carry that with you.
Yep. You said it.
Janelle Burke.
We've talked a lot about domestic violence, and I hope we can have enough time left to return to that, but I want to talk a little bit about sexual assault too. And Dot, would you again please describe for us what sexual assault is, and then let's talk about whether it occurs in a stranger situation or whether it occurs in a situation with people that we know.
Okay. Again, sexual assault includes several crimes, which can be rape, incest, forcible fondling, lewd and lascivious sex with a minor. Sexual assault can be rape of a spouse, a male rape, forced sex with an object, sodomy, same-sex rape. It can also be sexual harassment.
And as pointed out last week, that's an Idaho definition, but similar definitions are available in other states.
Absolutely, in other states, you bet.
And so, does this happen most often with strangers? I mean, we all think of how are we going to protect ourselves against the stranger, but what is the most likelihood scenario?
The most likelihood scenario is the acquaintance or date rape or someone you know. Certainly, when we think of a rapist, we like to think of the Hollywood stereotypical psycho thriller. A guy jumps out from behind a bush. Well, yeah, that can happen. In fact, it's not unheard of. I mean, it's happened here in Idaho recently, where we've had some stranger rapes, and certainly that generates a lot of fear in the community. However, the majority of the rapes and sexual assaults that occur are acquaintance, someone you know.
And it's a great majority. It's 90 to 95% of them.
And can you tell us some things that we can do, Sue, to avoid that kind of thing?
I think that Dot will help me a lot. She's getting her papers out.
I'm getting these preventative tips.
I think that a lot of it is education.
Absolutely.
Education of the community as a whole, education of our children, starting in middle school, if not earlier.
Absolutely. Getting into the school to address it with our young teens, what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior.
Yes.
Teaching them how to set those boundaries. Teaching them how society has been sending out mixed messages to our youth and to all of us about sexual things, sexual nature, what they have to do to be attractive, and so on and so forth. But teaching our kids also how not to mix oil and water. And I watched a video a while back produced by some students in Utah. The oil and the water metaphor being you can't mix the two. You can shake it up and it'll kind of glob together a little bit, but the water being the victim is never at fault, and FBI profilers will tell you this. The victim is never at fault. The oil being when we begin to say things like, well, what was she doing out there behind the Circle K? Or, why was she wearing such a short skirt? Or a lot of those ideas that have even, quite frankly, when I first started, popped into my head. Why wasn't the door locked? But you know what? Someone who is going to rape is going to rape. And it's never the victim's fault. And that's the bottom line.
I gave an example once to somebody where I said, I was talking to a man about it because he was doing some victim blaming. when we were discussing a particular incident, and I looked at him and I said, you know, my car is sitting parked right outside, and let's say I'd left my purse on the front seat of my car and left my car unlocked. I did something that wasn't very smart. You know, somebody comes along and steals my purse. I'm still the victim of a crime.
That doesn't give the perpetrator the
right
right to do that.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
You talked about some prevention and rape avoidance ideas. Only about 50%, not only, but about 50% of all rapes occur in our own homes. Therefore, it's an important part of rape prevention and securing our homes. The same precautions go for burglary as well, especially if it's a stranger rapist and if he's a breaking and entering type of guy. He's a burglar first. All windows should have secure locks. All entrances and garages should be well lighted. Inside and outside lights give a good deal of protection. Leaving lights on at night, automatic timers are an excellent investment because they disguise your schedule. Trim your bushes and your shrubberies so no one can hide in them. Don't leave tools, shovels and so forth sitting outside the door ready for someone to use leverage, break in. Get a watchdog if possible. Get to know your neighbors. Get with your neighborhood police department or sheriff's agency and find out how to establish a neighborhood block watch, especially if you're fearful of a stranger rapist, a serial rapist on the loose. Get something going like that. Join that neighborhood watch because they're excellent crime prevention groups. Go to Radio Shack and buy those signs. Use a peephole. That's the best defense system. Don't ever invite anybody in through the front door without first looking to see who that person is and ask for some identification of the person who comes to your home. Make calls, offer to make calls for people. Don't let them in the house. Make the call for them. Say, I'll make the call for you. Your car is another area where you're vulnerable. We could go on and on and on. Just some, but for date and acquaintance rape, we could talk a lot about DFSA, which is drug facilitated sexual assault. We don't. It's a growing problem. We're not seeing a lot of it here statistically, but
We call it alcohol.
yes,
That's the drug.
That's the big drug. That's the biggest one.
Thank you, Arnold.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I want to talk about the law enforcement side of these issues because both of you have training in previous experience in the law enforcement field, and I think this issue has come a long ways in the law enforcement officials' eyes. And tell us a little bit about how our law enforcement officials now are being trained on this issue, and maybe they're being a little bit more receptive to how to deal with this issue, in hopes that maybe hearing some of these things that you're going to tell us, that it may help victims to make that phone call, knowing that somebody on the other end has been trained on how to deal with this issue. And I'm not sure which one to address this to.
You want me to do it?
You do that so well.
Law enforcement officers now have a lot of training, especially with regard to domestic violence. Sexual assault, some, depending on where you're at across the country, how large the agency is, how accessible training is to them. There's been huge strides. I am very proud of the strides that have been made in the field. As I said earlier, when I started in law enforcement, domestic violence was not a crime, and rape was very seldom real rape. I'm being facetious. And now, domestic violence is a crime in all states, and law enforcement officers are handling it really appropriately. Most of them have policies that determine how they are to handle it, and they're trained on those policies. And it's interesting because over the course, I've kind of seen a pendulum swing, and we're starting to get somewhere in the middle on how to handle this, and that's good.
Great.
Another issue that, of course, relates to everything you said, and this is the most frightening of all. People are complex, and some people are so peaceful and nonviolent, and others are violent. We see that in the international realm, too, but to me, the most frightening of all about the danger of the life of for example, the woman, is that some men get so possessive of a person that under no circumstance are they going to let them go. They stalk them. We know we have stalking laws, but we know those are somewhat limited in their. You know, you can put someone in prison for a few days or in jail for a few days for stalking, but we've had some tragedies here where individuals say, "I won't let you go," and they simply kill them, or then they commit suicide. So, in what little time we have left, would you address? Isn't that an incredible challenge of how you deal with that?
Yeah, there is a component of training that we look for indications of dangerousness.
Risk factor. Lethality review.
Lethality, risk factors. I don't even like to say lethality because dangerousness.
Dangerousness.
Because one of the problems with lethality, then you're just looking at instances where people died, and sometimes that might be because EMS providers were too far out.
Yeah.
You know.
Absolutely.
But there are certain factors that you look for. Stalking is one of them. It's like I like to say, you look for these little red checks in your mind, and if you start hearing a number of these things, this is a dangerous situation. Threats of homicide or suicide on the part of the abuser. Help me out now.
Centrality of the victim, her location.
Her location, whether she's completely isolated.
Does he have weapons? Any weapons?
Is there access to weapons? Is there, how bad is the prior history of violence?
Case history.
Is there any evidence of also child abuse or pet abuse?
Pet abuse.
Is there, oh boy, help me out because I know there's some more and I can't think of them off the
Those
top
are
of
the
my
big
head.
ones.
Those are the big ones.
That's a long list. But in preventive, which is so important, and a number of those signs are present, and so you conclude, and law enforcement concludes, that there's a real good chance that she's going to be seriously injured or killed. And stalking laws are limited. The person's not yet engaged in, they've stalked her, but they've not actually engaged in direct physical violence. What are we not doing we could do to protect her? And we only have 20 seconds.
Oh, thanks. I mean, if the law doesn't apply, there's not a real lot that we can force upon the abuser. And then it's a matter of trying to convince the victim that they need to get to a safe place.
Get her to a safe place where he
Right.
can't reach her.
Yeah.
And family and others could be involved
Yeah.
in that process. Yes, well, thank you on that note. It's a very serious note. We must bring the program to conclusion. We want to thank both Sue and Dot for these 2 weeks. You've been most informative, and it's our goal always to help our viewers, and we hope that has happened with these programs. And good luck in your work. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again next week, and we'll turn to yet another issue. As you know, from week to week or every 2 or 3 weeks, we change the subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.